Thank you for joining us for the Thinking Kingdom podcast, where we have spiritual conversations in light of scripture that have us thinking kingdom. Here we go.
Yeah, we'll just roll with that. Me taking a big old drink of water. We're going. So if you're hearing this, you're
Listen,
the
it's
host now.
34 and I'm ready to go.
We're starting, whether
Okay.
you all know it or not. If for people that don't have access to video, I was taking a big old gulp of water, and Nate decides to steal my job just right from under me. So
I have an icebreaker question I was thinking about.
all right,
I was
go.
just making lunch. And I meant it's a very specific thing that I grew up eating. My mom would take a tortilla. Maybe it's not super specific. Take a tortilla and you take garden vegetable cream cheese, not regular cream cheese, garden vegetable cream cheese, and you spread it, and then you put ham on it. And she always put lettuce on it. But me and my wife, it's evolved into sprinkling some like shredded cheese on top of the cream cheese, then a few pieces of like deli ham, and then you roll it up and cut it up. And I was thinking, like, this is so specific to my family. And like, we know exactly, we call it sushi because the boys call it sushi because it looks like sushi cut up. But if I talked about that, other people would be like, that I don't do that. But like every family, every household has things like that's not a recipe, but like recipes and things that are like super specific to them. You see what I'm saying? Like, do you have anything like that?
I mean, I guess I'm thinking. Well, I think what you're describing is what other people may call, or what we call pinwheels. I don't know if that's the same.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Is that like the same?
Pinwheels. Yeah, pinwheels. But I feel like pinwheels is more of like a snacky party.
Yeah. Okay.
It's pinwheels.
Well, I just don't know what the ingredients are for pinwheels because I just don't know.
It's probably very similar to pinwheels, but like, yeah.
Okay. There's that.
We have things that like are staples that are like, I don't know. You know what I'm saying? It's weird.
I don't know if it's because we were poor, but we just squirt mustard in a slice of turkey and we rolled it up and ate it.
Yeah.
I love mustard, and I know that me just saying that made everybody, like, some people just were like, "Nope, I'm out of this podcast. That's disgusting." Never watching again or listening.
Vinegar. I'm a vinegar. We both like Tabasco.
Oh, vinegar. Oh man, I would. Yeah, you don't want to see me at Captain D's or a Long John Silver's. I mean, my whole everything is just drenched in vinegar. It's amazing, malt vinegar.
I grew up in Oklahoma, the barbecue sauce is like, I think it's is it Sweet Baby Ray's?
Yeah, there's one called that. Yeah.
That's Country. No, it's Head Country. Oh, that's the big one. And it's like brown sugar, like it's sweet, it's like sugar, brown sugar based. I think it's horrible, and everyone raves over it. But I hate it. I love vinegar based. I didn't know what vinegar based barbecue sauce was until I went to college, and like there was a place that had samplers of barbecue sauce. But like, dude, vinegar based is the stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm a vinegar person. So, anyways, that's just how things are with me.
Brought to you by
Gatorade Zero. I don't know if y'all can tell, but I'm suffering from some sort of, I have a cough, and I don't know if it's bronchitis or what, but I sound like a TV announcer. That's what I sound like. Before this podcast, I was doing, and now your featured presentation.
That's really good.
And that 3-time Grammy Award-winning artist. I hope I get TV deals from this. And people are brought to Christ at the same time.
Your head's in the wrong place.
Okay, I'll forego the fame and fortune as long as it brings people to Christ.
You're like, all right, I'll forget about the bringing people to Christ. I'm focusing on my TV deals.
Yeah. No, we're here. We're going to talk about Hebrews. We're going to do Versal first. Okay, so Nate went ahead and played. What we try to do is we try not to play Versal for the day that we record so we can just have it fresh. Nate went ahead and played it, and he got it in one try. He picked out the verse. Versal in one is what we call it. Because he's so smart. But I pulled it up. Let's pull it up. Let's do Versal together. So it's basically just me doing today's Versal.
I didn't even think about it. I was full transparency. I was on the potty today, and I was like, I'm gonna play Versal.
Nobody needs to know that. That was crazy. But I'm not cutting it out. I'm not doing it. Okay, so
I thought you'd be like, "Oh, you're funny, man," but you're making me embarrassed now.
oh no, dude, I do the same thing. Okay. Also, if you hear me cough a lot, just ignore me. Okay. The Versal for today, everybody can see it on the screen if you're watching on YouTube, but if you're listening, this is the reference. For bodily exercise has some value, but godliness has value in all things, having the promise of the life which is now and of that which is to come. So that's our Versal. I'm going to switch back to Nate's face and my face so he can make fun of me whenever I miss this. I don't have a main two. I gotta fix all this. My goodness. Okay. I'm thinking two places. The first one is in 1 Corinthians 9, which I don't think this one is. The other one is in the pastoral epistles. And I don't know. I'm not very dominant. I don't have First and Second Timothy structure in my. I don't think it's in Titus. So I think he's talking to Timothy. And I think it's in I'm just going to say 2 Timothy chapter 3. We're rolling with it, and you can tell me yes or no. But I'm doing 2 Timothy chapter 3. And Nate, as soon as I click this... Oh, whoops, I got to go back to Versal so everybody can see. Versal, 2 Timothy chapter 3. And I'm going to say just to burn some numbers, verse 14.
Ready? 1, 2, 3.
Oh, man. Is it 1 Timothy?
Do you want me to tell you?
Well,
yeah.
I mean, that would be my next guess. 1 Timothy.
Yeah.
So it's First Timothy. It's 1 Timothy 4 then. Yeah.
How do you rule? Are you saying because you know what 1 Timothy is chapter 1, chapter 2, 3?
No, I mean that would have. I mean, in all honesty, chapter 4 or 5 would have been my guess because I know what 1 Timothy 1, 2, and 3 are about.
Yeah.
And then chapter 4, he starts to talk about doctrines of demons, and he starts talking to Timothy specifically about these things. So it's either 4, 5, or 6, and I would guess 4 because I know 6 is. But I don't know beyond that. 1 Timothy 4. Did you know? Oh, you knew specifically what it was.
I knew where it was.
Let's just do 1 Timothy 4. Why do you know this verse?
That's a long story. Not really. There's just some explanation. As one who is interested in physical fitness, I have reminded myself that I got to get over it and not think too much about it. But this is something that I think about is I think it'd be cool one day to I'd love to own a gym someday, specifically a CrossFit gym. I do CrossFit. I think it's cool. And I think it'd be cool to name the gym after this verse as kind of a
So it's not because you want to know God's word. It's because you want a gym with a cool little.
It's because I want to. Yeah, I've thought about the logo. I've thought about the. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. All right. Versal in 4, 1 Timothy 4:8. So,
yep.
My other verse that I was thinking of, let's just pull it up on Logos. Let me just do
like Fitness 48 or something like that. Fitness 48. It'd be cool. People will be like, "What's that name about?" And be like, "Well, you come to the gym, and that's cool. But let me tell you about something more profitable."
Yeah, that's actually really cool. I was thinking 1 Corinthians 9, where it says every athlete exercises self-control in all things. Runners run a race. That's where I was thinking of, but it didn't really talk too much about godliness. So
godliness is the key word in 1 Timothy.
Yeah. So I haven't studied 1 Timothy. So what we do is we study through a lot of the books in school, and then outside of school, you really start to become more acquainted with these books. At least I do, because I didn't have too much of a church foundation before I went. I mean, a little bit. I knew the Bible topically before I went to school, I didn't appreciate the exegetical studies or expository studies that you're supposed to start off with foundationally before, then the Bible
Yeah.
topically. So, all right, so let's go to, we're doing Hebrews today, Nate. And this will kind of introduce the other videos that we're going to have with our guests, with Wayne Jones, Denny Petrillo, Corey Sawyers, and Michael Haidt. They each chose sections in the book of Hebrews based on Dan Owen's outline in his commentary. And let me bring that up just so you all can see what that is. Okay, I have it brought up on the screen now. And as you can see, Dan lays out, so what the book of Hebrews is, it's basically a sermon. And the Hebrew writer is the preacher using Old Testament texts that they would have been very familiar with, to encourage them in their faith, and encourage them to not leave Jesus, to continue to be faithful to Jesus. And so, in fact, in Hebrews chapter 13, it says, "Bear with my word or exhortation, or word of exhortation," one of the two. So this is a sermon. It's an exhortation through the Hebrew scriptures to continually and confidently live out their faith in Jesus whenever um, when they have other voices trying to persuade them otherwise, to come back to Judaism. So
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. Is the Hebrews is maybe this is totally foundational to most people, but the Hebrews, that's another word for the Jews or the Israelites. Would be the Hebrews, and so this
yeah,
letter to the Hebrew people who came out of Judaism, that have transitioned to Christianity, that are tempted to go back to Judaism. And what you had in Judaism was the sacrifices, and you had everything was very physical, and the temple and all these things. And after some time of being in Christianity, they're tempted for whatever reason to go back to Judaism, away from Jesus. And this sermon is, whoever the writer of this letter sermon is saying, no, 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 stick with Jesus, don't go back to Judaism. The whole idea, Denny talks about this in his breakdown, or whenever he does his section, that the main idea of Hebrews is Jesus is better. Jesus is better than Judaism, so stick with it. So yeah.
yeah. I mean, this letter wouldn't really resonate too much with the Gentiles because it's a culture that they're not familiar with. I mean, that's not fair. They probably would have been familiar with it, but that wasn't their culture. It wasn't their system of life. But they could still appreciate, just like we appreciate today, God's plan through the Israelite people to bring people, all nations, through the one Messiah, Jesus, and that's who we submit ourselves to. So going back to um, this breakdown, this is what I have up is Dan Owen's Hebrews commentary that you can purchase. I'll link that in the description. So this, I mean, it's on page 7 in the electronic form. I don't know what page it is in the actual one. I can look, but it doesn't matter. So he has it broke down of the exposition of various enthronement texts in chapters 1, verses 5 through 14. That's what I'm going to be breaking down as briefly as we can, because Nate and I, we're going to go ahead and record something else after this. So I'm going to try to work through chapter 1 as quickly as I can and yet effectively, but for you to kind of get the gist of what's going on with the writer's purpose in using these enthronement psalms, these enthronement texts in the first part of Hebrews. And as Denny had mentioned, which you haven't watched it yet, everybody, but he mentions that, and Dan has this in his commentary as a theme in the book of Hebrews, and rightfully so. It is the idea of better. Jesus is better than the angels. He is better than he has a better hope. It's a better covenant, better sacrifices, better promises, better country. And you see everything that's on the screen there. It's just this theme that the Christian system and her headship of Jesus Christ is better than any other system out there. And specifically for the Jews, it's better than the old sacrificial system. It's better than the old covenant. And so that's kind of a theme that we talk about in the book of Hebrews, that was talked about with Denny, and hopefully it's touched on in other classes. But going back to the breakdown real quick, and Nate, I'll kick it to you if you have anything else to say. What we did was we sent these guys an email, and we had them choose two of these texts that the Hebrew writer is exposing in his sermon. This is what Nate and I do in our preaching. We pick out texts and we present an expository sermon on them. We expose them for what they are in light of their context and its application to us today. That's what a sermon is. That's what we do in these types of sermons. And this is what the Hebrew writer is trying to do. It's just a really long sermon. So Denny worked through with us the exposition of Psalm 95 and 110. And 110 is really important because the Hebrew writer uses Psalm 110 all throughout the book of Hebrews. And it's funny because I don't know if you caught it with Denny, Nate, but I was starting to really lay into this idea how Psalm 110 is kind of foundational and it's sprinkled all
Yeah.
throughout the text. And he was like, well, I don't want to start there. And rightfully so, because he did what the assignment was. He worked from the exposition of Psalm 95, which is in chapters 3:7 through 4:13. And that led right into his Psalm 110. So Denny just did what he was supposed to do. That's how he had it broke down in his mind, but I was going a different direction. So I'm happy he kind of took over there because I was probably going to derail us from what we really needed to get done. So anyways, I don't know if you all want to jot that down or purchase Dan's commentary on this, but there it is. It's up on the screen for you. And then we did an episode with Corey. Nate wasn't available for that. So Corey did Habakkuk 2, verses 3 through 4. And then he did also the exposition of Psalm 8, verse 4 through 6. So, which is where we're going to end today in my lesson in this session. So that's really kind of what we're going to do with this series that we're doing. It's the Hebrew writer's use of the Old Testament scriptures in his sermon in this book, and that's really what the whole book is about. So, Nate, any thoughts or anything before I kind of?
Yeah, I was just going to clarify further, kind of what you're saying about the exposition of these Old Testament texts. So I don't have a super firm grasp on Hebrews, like you were talking about a minute ago, not having a super firm grasp on First Timothy yet. I haven't studied Hebrews after school or taken a deep dive. So I'm excited for this podcast to have an opportunity to do that. But with kind of my, I guess, limited knowledge of Hebrews, what I understand is, and maybe this is just repeating what you've already said, but the Hebrew people that he's writing to were tempted to go back to the Jewish system, and they had a very firm grasp, and they held in very high esteem the Jewish, the Old Testament. So what the Hebrews writer is doing, the way he goes about proving that Jesus is the Messiah, you need to hang on to him, don't return back to the Old Testament, is he's just saying, hey, we're going to go look at these Old Testament passages. We're going to go borrow from Psalm 8, and we're going to talk about Psalm 8 for a few chapters. Now we're going to talk about Psalm 95 for a few chapters, talk about how that proves Jesus is the Messiah. Stick with him. Then we're going to talk about Psalm 110 for a while. And in the Hebrews' mind, they're like, I know those verses. I know those Psalms. And to hear whoever this writer is pointing, how using how those point to Jesus, or explaining how those point to Jesus, that's clicking in their head. And they're like, okay, this all makes sense. The Old Testament pointed at Jesus the whole time. So again, you already said all that. I'm just maybe putting it a different way. The Hebrews author is reaching back into the Old Testament, pulling from these various texts, spending a couple chapters here, or a couple chapters on each one, saying how this Old Testament text proves it. And whenever you see the book like this, that throughout the whole book of Hebrews, all he's doing is explaining these Old Testament texts, that really comes to life. And where you're at in Hebrews, all it is an explanation of an Old Testament text, and how that Old Testament text points to Jesus. Man, that makes a lot of sense. That really clicks, and it would have clicked for the Hebrews, the original audience too.
Yeah, and I liked with our episode with Denny that's coming up. Maybe we should just not even keep on referencing the
Yeah.
because it's going to be coming and you're going to love it. So let's just go ahead and dig into uh, the first part of Hebrews. So I'm just going to read through chapter 1 and just kind of give my comments and thoughts along the way. So long ago, at many times and in many ways, God spoke to our fathers by the prophets, but in these last days, He has spoken to us by His Son, whom He appointed heir of all things, through whom He also created the world. He is the radiance of the glory of God and the exact imprint of His nature, and He upholds the universe by the word of His power. After making purification for sins, He sat down at the right hand of the Majesty on high, having become as much superior to angels as the name He has inherited is more excellent than theirs. So, just in opening with the book of Hebrews, a significant theme is coming out. So, God is speaking, number one. Um, so, God spoke to our fathers by the prophets. The prophets were the um, voice mouthpieces of God. They were the ones communicating on behalf of God. Anybody that's speaking on behalf of God is that is essentially God speaking. Moses was a prophet. Nathan, we remember David and Bathsheba with that incident in First Samuel, uh, or Second Samuel rather. And so these prophets are people speaking for God. So, but God still spoke through these people. And in verse 2, for us today and for these people that are receiving this letter, God is speaking in these last days. Now, this is in reference to the Messianic age. The Jew knew that in the last days, the Messiah is the one who's going to be reigning, and he essentially is going to be the one speaking for God. And that is, well, Jesus has in these last days, God has spoken to us by his son. And you can look at, the prophet Joel for this idea of last days. Um, there's plenty of resources out there for the last days, but the last days, just in brevity, is in reference to um, the last days in which the Messiah is reigning to the Jewish mind. So there's nothing else to look forward to. The Messiahship and the reign of God through the Messiah, the throne of God forever established through David it's it. That's the only thing that the Jews look forward to. So it was the last days. So it's not how we think about the last days with apocalyptic imagery, and that's just not how the Jews would have seen it. But what?
So
Go
I
ahead.
just to clarify or ask a clarifying question. Whenever we hear last days in modern day 21st century Christianity, our mind goes to the end of time. When the
Mhm.
Jews heard last days 2,000 years ago, based on their understanding of Old Testament text, whenever the phrase last days comes up, they're thinking the time where the chosen Jewish Messiah is going to be
Enthroned forever.
enthroned. All right. Okay.
It's
So,
it's a time period, not the end of all things.
yeah. Yeah.
So that
And that
is
comes from Joel 2, Zechariah,
a lot of
and 11,
times
12. Yeah.
in the minor prophets they mentioned in the last days, in the latter days. So
Cool.
that's what would have been going on. But here in verse 2 it says he has spoken to us by his son. Now the personal pronoun right here, his, isn't in the text. It's he has spoken to us by a son. So I know this translation seems to kind of already reach the conclusion that the Son is Jesus, but the Hebrew writer hasn't got there yet. He's not even going to mention Jesus' name until chapter 2. So he's just letting us know that hey, God he's had his final say through one person, through his son, but this guy is also the one whom he appointed heir of all things. We talked about all things in our Ephesians study. We talked about all things in we looked at it in Colossians, but through whom also he created the world. So this son is just no ordinary person. He's deity. Verse 3. He is the radiance of the glory of God and the exact imprint of his nature. He is God. He is the exact thing who God is, exact being. He upholds the universe by the word of his power. Here it is. After making purification of sins for sins, he sat down at the right hand of the Majesty on high. So in verse 3, he's discussing. This is his qualifications. so to speak. Jesus's qualifications. And he's the one that is God. He is the one who is priest. See, after making purifications, we talked about this in Denny's. You talked about that, he seemed to touch on here at the end of chapter 1, Psalm 110, what Denny was exposing. And you brought up the fact that it goes back to 100, or, at the end of chapter 1. I say it goes back all the way here to chapter 3, because Jesus is in the priestly role. He makes purification for sins. That is a priestly role. And after this, he sat down at the right hand of majesty on high. He is in a position of authority, of kingship, of rulership. So this verse describes his priestly role and his role as king at the right hand of God. And he just kind of just almost sprinkles that in. So what is the Hebrew writer trying to do? He's trying to prep their mind, and he's describing who this person is, and that's going to be Jesus. And he says, listen, I'm describing who this guy is. You don't want to turn your back on the one who upholds the universe. You don't want to turn your back on the one who created the world. If you read through Hebrews, this term, through whom he created the world, pops up a couple more times, I think 2 times at least, in the book of Hebrews. He constantly refers to it. So,
I think I didn't know that definite article, or I guess it's not the definite article, his son in verse 2. I didn't know that was missing. It's just a son. It's left generic. And I think, obviously that's intentional. I think it's cool to think about. It's so hard for us to get into the mind because we know the Messiah is Jesus. I think it's so hard for us to get into the headspace of the ancient Jew who, like, they knew someone was coming, but Jesus wasn't a famous name. It was Jesus of Nazareth was a nobody. It's this Messiah is going to be somebody, but we don't know that it's Jesus of Nazareth. So there's, whenever he's connecting all these Old Testament images of, the creator of the world, or upholds the universe by the word of his power, his son, they're like, yeah, but they're not thinking Jesus of Nazareth the way that we do. And now in a chapter, he's going to say, yep, it is Jesus. Stick with this Jesus. Stick with Jesus of Nazareth.
yeah.
I just think that's a cool. It's so interesting to get into their headspace. It's very challenging.
Yeah, I completely agree. So, going through these qualifications, setting up who Jesus is, he's become better than angels. So angels in the Jewish mind, they're some significant dudes. They're the one who came to um, Daniel, and they're the messengers of God. It's the
Abraham.
yeah they're the intermediaries,
Yeah.
and for Moses to present the message of the second of the old covenant. So angels, they had a high regard for, because they were God's messengers. They were sent right from the throne room, and Jesus is better than them, as he's going to talk about in chapter 2. It's a exposition of a rather popular text that we are a little while, we're a little lower than the angels. Our human status is that which is lower than the angels. So you always saw, as a Jew, the angels being the higher messengers, the higher, um,
Yeah.
probably more significant ontological status. That's how they would have viewed it. Now we know that we are God's crowning creation of physical things. But anyways, so this person who God is speaking through is superior. Well, what's another way you can say that? He is better than the angels. Well, what makes this son better than the angels? Well, the name he has inherited is more excellent, is better than theirs. And then he's going to tell us kind of what this name is. So, a couple things maybe about the son very briefly. There's a number of different ways that the term son is mentioned in the Bible. You can think of son as just coming forth from God. So God has spiritual sons or sons of God, and he has sons of man. He has a spiritual family and an earthly family. In the Jewish mind, as he's going to talk about here, this idea of son is that of kingship, of authority. Whenever David is appointed as and anointed as king, he's going to talk about that coming up. So the son, and especially in the ancient Near Eastern mind, the king of whatever nation, the peoples of that nation viewed their king as being endowed or as if he were God himself. That's how the ancient Near Eastern culture would have viewed kings, is almost deity themselves. So I don't think that's too far off of how the Jew would have viewed David. Now they would have not seen him as a god, but definitely ruling in place for God, not in place of God, but ruling for God. So there's that sense, and I guess just in the normal familial sense, a son can be mentioned in scriptures. So the thing is this person is unique. We know in John, right, Nate? It's God so loved the world that he gave his unique son. Okay, so and that's what the term monogenes means: is he is unique. He is one of a kind. Um, in that he is God. He is an Elohim. He is he shares the um I want to be careful about how I say this unless people take me differently. Um Jesus isn't a created being. Know that. He is God. He is not a created being. He's the one that created everything, but he is still an Elohim, meaning he is a God. He is the God, but his status is like that of other gods, like angels, supernatural beings, things that aren't a part of the physical world. Demons, Satan, angels, God, Jesus, Spirit, those are all Elohim. Okay. Um,
Elohim is a I always grew up thinking Elohim was just a name for Jehovah, Yahweh,
mhm.
and it's not. Elohim rather is a description of this of someone's. It's a description of someone's space.
Yeah. It's
So
just,
it's a spiritual being. He's
yeah.
just yeah.
A spiritual being is really all that is. The, the Samuel, when he's summoned through Saul, he is called an Elohim.
Mhm.
There in I think it's 1 Samuel 28. So the disembodied spirit of Samuel is called an Elohim because he's apart from the physical world. Well, does that mean that Samuel's a god? No, that doesn't mean he's a god. It's just what his status is.
So what are you getting at saying that Jesus is a what I
Well, my
maybe
point,
I
my
lost you.
wait, well, I took a rabbit trail in saying that
Okay,
Jesus is unique in that he holds, even though he's an Elohim, he holds a status that is different
I got
than
you.
the angels in that he is better than, and because
Right.
he is God, and
Hmm.
that's really
And
what I'm
you're
saying.
you're yeah, you're in verse 4 saying he's this whoever this son is has become much more superior. Yeah. Okay. I got you. Okay.
Well, yeah, I really went off on a rabbit trail to John and talking about his uniqueness as an Elohim,
Yeah.
but I wasn't arguing anything from Hebrews. I just went off on a
Okay.
rabbit trail. So verse 5 is where we picked up. How do we know that Jesus, in what way is Jesus better than the angels? Verse 5, for to which of the angels did God ever say, you are my son, today I have begotten you? So I don't know if the name that he has inherited is connected with son, because he's going to mention son number of times throughout this text. And as I'm going through, I'm highlighting where he's mentioning this idea of son and how the Old Testament text is presenting these psalms, these enthronement psalms. Um, this son, even though it's talking about here in Psalm chapter 2 and verse 7, let's just go over there real quick. This is David's psalm reflecting on the time that God made him king. Why did the nations rage and the peoples plot in vain? The kings of the earth set themselves, and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against His anointed. So this is a messianic song. This is an anointed. But the anointed here in this psalm is talking about David. Then he will speak to them in his wrath and terrify them in his fury, talking about the nations that are going against God, saying, as for me, I have set my king. See that idea? King in verse 6, anointed in verse 2, and my son in verse 7. These are all terms that we have to connect together here in the book of Psalms. I will tell of the decree the Lord said to me. This is now David speaking in verse 7. You are my son. Today I have begotten you. Okay? So in David's mind, in some way, he saw, or the way God spoke to him is he designated him as king or as his son. I don't know why it's called son. I don't know why I use that familial language. I don't know why. But we do see here in Psalm chapter 2 and verse 7, as well as verse 6 and verse 2, that son here in the Jewish mind is connected with rulership, kingship. Okay, let's traverse over back to Hebrews. So Jesus is better than the angels in that God has chosen him to be king. Now, what's interesting is as you get down to the bottom, it says, God has anointed you, verse 9, with the oil of gladness beyond your companions. Now, in the psalm, as it's applied in the Old Testament, he's talking about the king of Judah, possibly David, whoever, during this time. But he is elevated above your companions, meaning humans. Jesus is in the spiritual space. He is elevated above his companions, which is he is better than the angels. So you see this kingship, this enthronement text as it's applied to Jesus. So what the Hebrew writer is trying to tell them is, listen, this Jesus that you're thinking about abandoning, you know how you have such a high regard for angels? Guess what? He's better than the angels, okay?
Yeah.
And how am I going to prove that? Well, because God never said to anyone else outside of humans that you are my son. But this is how he's applying it in the spiritual sense to Jesus. So any questions so far, Nate, on any of this?
Do you have anything on this word begotten in verse 5 from that quote of Psalm 2:7?
I don't have anything I think worth telling. It says, no, I don't have anything.
Okay. That's
I
fine.
think it's just the day that he announced, kind of like the day that you became father to Josie or your kids. It was just the day of, hey, you are now representing me in this space of rulership, you know.
Yeah, we were kind of talking around why would David use the word son? Why is there that familial language to recognize himself as the king? Right? Am I understanding kind of this discussion right? Why why did David use the word son?
Yeah.
Okay. I wonder, is it connected to, kingship it's passed down through a bloodline,
Yeah.
right? And so you inherit kingship. So he's saying, me being your king is as if I'm your child because you're handing your kingship as father to me, a son. So
Yeah.
me calling you king is like me begetting you as a child because you're my son, inheriting my throne. I think you see words like that in.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think you're spot on, personally. I think that's right.
In chapter 1, verse 2 of Hebrews, it says the heir of all things. And then chapter 4, he's becoming superior to the angels as the name, I can't even read, having become much superior to angels as the name he has inherited. So he inherited kingship as a son. The angels haven't inherited kingship because they're not the son. But so the son and king, I think that's in my mind, that's the connection is
Yeah, that makes sense to me. And just to move it further, so what did Jesus do that allowed him to inherit this name that the angels didn't do? And I think that's really what's a good question because he addresses it coming up. Because,
Yeah,
well, namely his advent, his coming, in his incarnation,
yeah.
and he's going to talk about it. You have loved righteousness and hated wickedness, in verse
Hmm.
9. Therefore, God, your God, has anointed you with
Yeah,
oil and gladness beyond you. So here's the thing. I know we're skipping ahead, but Jesus could only demonstrate that he loved righteousness and hated wickedness in the incarnation, in his fleshly earthly life. Um, he was continually faithful. I mean, he did love righteousness and hate wickedness as an Elohim, as a member of the Trinity. But
yeah.
that
In
was,
heaven before he was
hmm
a man. Yeah,
but it couldn't be. I mean, he proved that in his incarnation, and after his death, burial, and resurrection, it was only then that Jesus assumed that role. Matthew chapter 28, verse 18. Um, all things have been given to me in heaven and on earth. Jesus didn't talk about that during it was only after he died and then was rose from the dead that he could speak of himself as being this king over all things because he
Where,
lived. What would you say?
I'm sorry, I'm thinking out loud. Go ahead.
No, what were you going to say?
Where is the where does it talk about his sonship? He became a son after his resurrection. That's in Hebrew somewhere, right?
Mm, yeah.
The big stuff I remember Dan talking about at Bear Valley that I'm like, I was in my freshman semester and
Yeah.
I didn't know which way was up.
No.
But I remember this stuff. But yeah, so the point you're making
Well,
is
look at verse 9, maybe chapter 2. But we see him for a little while was made lower than the angels, namely Jesus, crowned with glory and honor because of the suffering of
yeah,
death.
yeah.
So that, yeah, yeah,
Okay. So in 2:9, 2:9 connects to 1:9. When was he anointed as king? It wasn't at his incarnation, it was at his resurrection. And why was it at his resurrection was he crowned king or son? Because through his death, I'm going back to a place like Philippians chapter 2, his death, he proved his willingness to obey God to the point of death. And so it was only after that death, at resurrection, that he was anointed because he proved his worth with his obedience. Am I tracking?
I think that's exactly right, personally.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah. Going back up to chapter 5 or verse 5, I think I don't want to go off another rabbit trail. Golly, I hate doing this, but it's worth noting. Um, in the Old Testament, there is a context for which these things are being written. So, like I said, in verse 5, in the Old Testament, it's describing the day that David made that God made David king. What the Hebrew writer is now doing through the Holy Spirit is he's now applying it to Jesus and
Yeah.
saying, now God has elevated him to the status of king above all things. And he's using this Old Testament verse to solidify this idea in their mind that Jesus is now king. And so I don't know if they would have been like, hold on, Hebrew writer, this is talking about David. What gives you the liberty? Well, let me tell you what gives you the liberty. Miraculous gifts confirm
Right.
the word. Um,
Yeah.
all these other things that would prove that God's word is true. And not only that, but the people who have accepted this document as somebody who writes and speaks for God, that authorizes him to
Right.
use these texts like that. So
Yeah.
go
So
go
the
ahead.
Hebrews author or the Hebrews writer, as they receive this letter, they would say, okay, we know this was about David, and you're trying to use this verse to say it's about Jesus. What kind of authority do you have to tweak the meaning of it to something about Jesus? And the Hebrews writer says, well, watch this. And he heals some guy's leg or raises somebody from the dead or something crazy. And they're like, gotcha. You have power from God. You can
Well,
You have this authority.
yeah, that I think so. I mean, you're not going to accept something as scripture unless you have qualifications for proving that.
What
So,
verse is it that says the miracles or the confirmation of the word?
well,
It's at the end of the Gospels, right?
Mark 16, I think it's verse 19 and 20. But you don't have to really go that far in Hebrews because he talks about Jesus in chapter how the message was given to um, Jesus as it was tested by us to us by those who heard, while God also bore witness by signs, wonders, and various miracles
Gotcha.
by gifts of the Holy Spirit. So,
Go.
and he uses another verse in verse 5, or again. And this one's coming from 2 Samuel chapter 7 and verse 14. I will be to him a father, and he shall be to me a son. So if you go over to 2 Samuel chapter 7 and verse 14, God is talking to Solomon, or excuse me, God is talking to David, sorry. And let's just go to that reference real quick. 2 Samuel 7, let's start beginning in verse 12. When your days are fulfilled, and you lie down in with your fathers, I will raise up your offspring after you, who shall come from your body, and will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. So here's something significant. He will build a house for my name. Who did that? Solomon. I will be to him a father, and he shall be to me a son.
Yeah.
So he's talking to David. Or maybe this is a prophet talking to David. I think one of the two. It doesn't really matter because a prophet speaks to, for God. So,
Says that Nathan said to the king,
okay.
not,
Yeah. Nathan's talking to, yeah. So same,
yeah.
Nathan's letting him know, but yeah, you're right. I will be to him a father, talking about Solomon, and he shall be to me a son. Here it is. So the Hebrew writer only quotes this first part of chapter 7 and verse 14, but read this next part. It's very important. When he commits iniquity. Did Jesus commit iniquity, people? I mean, you know the answer to that. So, but what's important is the Hebrew writer is capturing this part of the verse very specifically to expand on the topic and idea of kingship. Kingship. These are enthronement texts. This is, and what the Hebrew writer is trying to do is put Jesus on this pedestal that he well deserves to be on, this kingly pedestal. And he says, if you're going to forsake Jesus, you're forsaking him who is king of the universe. And then later in the book of Hebrews, as we're going to talk about with Denny, we're going to see his place in the universe as not only king, but also priest.
Yeah.
And again, when he brings the firstborn into the world, he says, okay, so the firstborn in Jewish thought isn't the first person that's born in the family. It's the idea of preeminence. David is called the firstborn. I don't know what psalm it is, but we could do our homework later and look it up. David is described as the firstborn. Well, David wasn't the firstborn, but he is the firstborn in the sense of he has preeminence. He has the first place. He occupies the first place. So,
Psalm 89.
Verse 28 or something.
Psalm 89, 26, and 27.
Okay, 27.
So you would have been good in versal there.
I would have been okay. I wouldn't have got the specific psalm, but I remember reading it somewhere. So, and again, when he brings the firstborn into the world, he says, let all the kings worship him. Now he's quoting from Deuteronomy in Psalm 97, where, in Deuteronomy 32, this is a song of Moses where it talks about he's praising God for everything that God has done, and because of who he is and what he's done, all of the host of heaven, they need to worship him. So the Hebrew writer is saying, well, guess what? Because Jesus is better than the angels, all of the angels, or all the gods, as it's talked about in Deuteronomy, you see how, I hope the people see how in the Old Testament, angels and gods, they're kind of used interchangeably. Just because the angels are Elohim. They are spiritual beings.
What do you mean they're used interchangeably? You're saying when someone sees an angel, that's God speaking. Is that what you're saying?
Well, what I'm saying is angels are of the same category as God in the sense of that they're spiritual beings.
I got you. Yeah.
What we have done is we've tied we've attributed certain characteristics to the term God. The English term God, we have tied ideas like holiness, omnipotence, omniscience, and that's what we have done as Western culture people. We have tied characteristics to what Elohim is. In the
Yeah.
Hebrew Bible, that's not what Elohim is. I mean, Samuel is not omniscient. Samuel is not omnipotent, yet he's described as an Elohim. An Elohim is just a description of who these things are in the spiritual world. So, anyways, the reason why I bring that up, Nate, is because here in Deuteronomy chapter 32, verse 43, it says, "Rejoice with him, O heavens, bow down to him, all gods." That's um, that's in the that's in the Hebrew, the gods.
Yeah.
So, but if you because of the Septuagint, they see the gods as angels.
Yeah.
And really, anybody in the spiritual realm need to bow down and worship him, whether it's
You're
Satan.
saying in chapter 1, Hebrews 1, verse 6, that quote from Deuteronomy 32, let all God's angels worship him. The original quote in Hebrew is let all of God's Elohim worship him.
Mm-hmm.
Let
Yeah.
all of the gods worship him.
Yeah. The spiritual beings worship him. The host of heaven.
Yeah.
So here's the thing, is that's how it's seen in Deuteronomy. It's talking about Yahweh God. And the Hebrew writer is saying now about Jesus, guess what? If Yahweh God is worthy of worship by these individuals, guess who also is worthy of this worship by these angels and gods? Jesus. Don't abandon him. Now he gets in verse 7. He says, okay, well, let's deal with the angels. Of the angels, he says, he makes his angels winds or spirits and his ministers a flame of fire. He says, the angels, their purpose, they're just ministers. They just carry out my word. They're messengers. That's all they are, okay? But, verse 8, but of the Son, he says, your throne, O God, is forever and ever. The scepter of your uprightness is the scepter of your kingdom. You have loved righteousness and hated wickedness. Therefore, God, your God, has anointed you with the oil of gladness beyond all your companions. Okay? Now, this is originally talking about the king who was ruling in place of God, which may be the reason why this person is called O God. Therefore, your throne, O God, is forever and ever.
Where's that from?
This is from Psalm 95 or Psalm 45, verse 6 and 7. And so the Hebrew writer is applying it to the enthronement of Jesus in the spiritual realm above his companions, that is, above the angels. When in the original context of the Old Testament, it's talking about how this king is elevated above his companions, his human companions.
Yeah.
So this is saying above the angel companions because Jesus is Elohim.
Yeah.
Like the angels, like the spiritual beings, okay? Go ahead. What's your question?
I'm beating the dead horse, but
It's okay.
this is again, this isn't Jesus yet. I mean, it is, but the Hebrew author, this isn't Jesus yet. This is just God's son, whoever it is.
Yeah. This person,
Whenever we think Jesus of Nazareth, he's not an Elohim, but the Hebrews author right now at this part in his book, he hasn't introduced this son is Jesus of Nazareth.
yeah.
He's just saying this son, which I don't know why that feels like such a significant point to me, but I just feel like all the Hebrews recipients would be like, yes, we're tracking, like we get all this, and then in a second he's going to name drop this guy is Jesus.
Oh, by the way, it's Jesus who's, yep.
Yeah.
In that verse that we read.
Like, yeah.
Yeah. So he doesn't, it's kind of like in the beginning of John's gospel, in the beginning was the word and the word was with God and the word was God. And it's a capital W. Well, it's really not a capital W until verse 14.
Right.
And the word became flesh. And we know that that flesh is Jesus. But because we know that later on in the text, they go ahead and capitalize.
Where does he introduce? I'm looking. Where is it in Hebrews that he even
Yeah, it was in
comes
that
out.
verse. It was in that verse that we just read. But we see him for a little while was made lower than the angels, namely Jesus. Verse 9 of chapter 2.
Oh, chapter 2. Okay, dude.
Yep. But obviously, and really, verse 3 of chapter 2, it was declared at first by the Lord. Well, the Lord who? The Lord Jesus.
Yeah.
And is attested to us by those who heard, while God, see, the Lord and God, there are separate people. So,
Mhm.
but we don't see that anything's Jesus until chapter 2, verse 9.
And is that namely? Maybe this is maybe I'm placing more significance on this than it should be. But is that namely in chapter 2, verse 9? Like, is namely? Is he really building to that point? And he's like, and his name is Jesus.
Yeah, I do think so. Like, oh, by the way, it's Jesus type of
Yeah.
thing. Yeah.
All right. Sorry.
No, you're
I'm,
good.
I'm
You're fine. So you can ask anything. But in verse 9, you just interrupt me. You have loved righteousness and hated wickedness. This is what Jesus did whenever he was incarnated. He demonstrated that it's not my will, but your will be done in every aspect. And because he demonstrated that
yeah.
perfectly, that qualifies you for something. And he's now above the angels. Okay. And you, Lord, talking about Jesus, but in the original context, it's talking about Yahweh, God. You, Lord, laid the foundation of the earth in the beginning, and the heavens are the work of your hands. Okay, you see this? The heaven are the works of your hands. Go
Yeah.
back up to chapter 1,
Yeah.
verse 2. Through whom he created the world. Isn't that interesting, people? I think that's something that's really cool. They will perish, but you remain. They will wear out like a garment, like a robe. You will roll them up like a garment. They will be changed, but you are the same, and your years will have no end. Well, your years, in what sense? Your reign. Your years of reign will have no end, but also your years have no end because you are God. You are Yahweh. Excuse me, people. I'm
In
sorry.
verse 11, that they will perish. Is the they talking about the foundations of the earth, or is the they the angels?
Yeah,
It's not the
yeah, the foundation of the earth. Yeah.
yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And then he gets back to the angels, verse 13, and we're almost done, people. And to which of the angels has he ever said, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet? This is another sprinkling of Psalm 110. So you see this imagery of enemies being a footstool. Well, that's because you conquered them. That is a kingship rule, because whenever you conquered your enemies, they might as well be a footstool because you conquered them. They're so far beneath you. And that's what Jesus did, is that not that Jesus conquered angels, it's just describing his place as king, as ruler. Um, but then in verse 14, he describes angels further. He says, listen, are they not all ministering spirits sent out to serve the sake of those who are to inherit salvation? And that's us. We're the ones to inherit salvation. So the angels serve us in some way. I don't know how they do that today, or even if they do that today. I just know that this text says that angels are for our benefit. They minister to us, saints. Austin, that was then.
Okay.
Austin, that was then, and this is now. Okay, I don't know. Maybe so, maybe not. But it's hard to say that this ended with just them. I don't know. I don't really know what I'm concluding. My conclusion is I just don't know. That's my
This
conclusion.
text says this. Yeah.
Yeah, well, the text says this, so I can't go on beyond what the text says. So,
Yeah.
so that really kind of wraps up chapter 1. Before getting into where Corey's going to introduce chapter 2, beginning in verse 5. So, what is the Hebrew writer doing here in Hebrews chapter 1? He is pumping out all of these enthronement texts that describe Jesus um, as better than the angels. He is better than his companions. And the reason why he's in that position is because he came down here and he demonstrated that he loved righteousness and hated wickedness, thus qualifying him for the ultimate position in all the universe, both in the spiritual realm and here. All authority has been given to me in heaven and on earth. Matthew 28:18. Okay? And this happened after his death and resurrection. And we see him reigning. Even right now, as we're recording this podcast, he is reigning. So don't walk away from Jesus. Don't give up Jesus. If you look real quick how this connects to chapter 5, real quick, Nate.
I have one more question after this.
Okay, that's fine. Chapter 5, look at verse 5. So also Christ did not exalt himself to be made high priest, but was appointed by him who said, "You are my son, today I have begotten you." Okay, that is his kingly role. He has also said in another place, "You are a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek." That is his priestly role. And then he goes on to say, about this, verse 11. Well, the this, in Austin's opinion, goes back to his kingly role in verse 5 and his priestly role in verse 6. He says, I have much to say about his kingly role and his priestly role. Actually, probably more about his priestly role, because he already handled here in chapter 1 about his kingly role. I have much to say about this, but you're not willing to accept it. And then in chapter 6, he says, don't forget the promise of Abraham. Oh, and the oath, where God says in Psalm 110, verse 4, I have sworn and I will not change my mind. You are a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. And that's in chapter 6. Oh, by two unchangeable things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Verse 17.
Verse 6, 16 through 17. An oath is final for confirmation. That is the oath of him being a priest, so that by two unchangeable things, that is the promise to Abraham and the oath. Anyways, we could talk about that maybe a little bit later. Anyways, what was your question?
Okay. This is my tracing of themes and words and stuff. Okay, so chapter 1, I've traced all the times, which maybe you're doing it too in Logos. Son, heir, inheritance, begotten, father, son, firstborn, throne, anointed, all of those, enthronement words that go, inheritance is tied in with that. And all of it is pointing to Jesus, right? Here's what I've done in, my Hebrews, all those yellow boxes, all that. Okay.
That looks good.
Then when you get to verse 14, this is just because I'm tracing themes. This word inherit shows up again. Are they not all ministering spirits sent out to serve for the sake of those who are to inherit? And because I've been tracing themes, I'm like, inherit. We've seen that over and over and over again in the chapter. It's always referred to Jesus, but now it's about those who inherit salvation. The mind that's tracing themes, maybe this is wrong, but I'm making this connection of he spent this whole chapter saying Jesus is going to inherit the throne as son, but now in the last verse of the chapter, he says Christians, followers also inherit something as so he's been spending 13 verses talking about how Jesus is higher than the angels as God's son, and he spends this last verse and he says but you guys too also have an inheritance as almost like we've talked about before, how Jesus is not just our Lord, but he's our brother, and we are in his family. We're a son of God, just like Jesus is a son of God. Obviously different, but also the same. We share status with Christ as God's son and receive an inheritance as he received an inheritance. We talk all the time something I've been trying to talk more about in salvation is we don't just receive salvation, we take part, we have authority in salvation. We inherit authority and power and dominion in salvation the way that Jesus did. So I don't know, this is all me just kind of talking in circles or just kind of spitballing or thinking out loud, but that inheritance, every other place in chapter 1 is about Jesus. Now we have an inheritance as well. Not only do the angels serve Jesus, but they also serve us.
Yeah, and boy, we can go down a lot of rabbit trails. In the book of Revelation, it says that we are going to rule. In Ephesians chapter 2, that we're going to get to in our Ephesians study, it talks about how we're seated with Christ. We're seated with Christ. Well, where's Christ? Christ is at the right hand of God ruling. So
Yeah.
we get to participate in this rulership with Jesus in some way. But here in Ephesians, I think the ultimate messaging is,
Hebrews.
what did I say?
You said Ephesians. It's all right.
Yeah. In Hebrews, the messaging is Jesus inherited something, we inherit something. True sons of God inherit something. Jesus inherited this rulership, this kingly rule. He got something, and we get something too. We get salvation because we're a part of his kingdom. So, do you want to leave the kingdom?
Right.
That's what the Hebrew writer is trying to get to. You're about to abandon, you're about to renounce your citizenship.
Yeah.
You don't want to do that.
Yeah.
So, that's how chapter 1 talks about and uses these psalms to describe Jesus and his role as being better than the angels as king. Yeah, so that's I think that's pretty much all I have. Do you have more questions that maybe just let this mold kind of work your brain a little bit? If you all have questions, don't hesitate to reach out to us, thinkingkingdompodcast@gmail.com. We'll talk about things, or you can say, hey, I have a concern about this verse. You said this, and I've seen it a little differently, and that's okay. Let's just engage in some dialogue, and we'll try to learn God's word together. But we look forward to our guests with Denny, Wayne, Michael, and Corey as we navigate the rest of this book, as they've already done, but you haven't seen yet. So, got a lot of great things on the horizon. So, I guess we'll begin our outro. Nate, anything?
Nope.
Okay. All right, everybody. You have a good rest of your day, and hopefully you'll take this into your car or into your homes and just think about kingdom things, deepen your appreciation and love for Jesus, who he is as King and High Priest of our lives. Okay. Thanks, and have a great day.
See ya.